If you like React Query, you'll be excited to hear about Tanstack's new framework, Tanstack Start, and it's now in alpha. So let's dive into Start, especially the uniquely powerful server function support that it has, and see how it compares with something like NextJS. Oh, and I'll also show you how to use the new use cache directives in NextJS, so stick around for that. Let's get right into it. All right, so here is the getting started page for Tanstack Router, which is the basis of Tanstack Start. So Tanstack Start is basically Tanstack Router plus Vinci, which is a platform that a lot of folks are using, most notably Solid Start. So here's the getting started page to just get you started building out your Tanstack Start app. What I did was I went over to the end result of that, which is this stack blitz, and then I took this example and added on ShadCN and Tailwind so that it just looked a lot nicer. All right, let's go take a look at that code. So here's the code for my Tanstack Start application. All of this code is, of course, available to you for free in a link in the description right down below. The application really starts over in the app directory. Within that, there is routes, and I've got a couple of routes in here. We're going to take a look at index. That will be the / route. So here's our index code. It starts off with create file route. You give it the route, in this case, /, and then it gives you back a function that you then invoke with some options. So in this case, we're going to say that the rendering component for this route is home. That home just gives you hello from Tanstack Start in big old Tailwind. Let's go take a look. There we go. Nice, big, bold hello from Tanstack Start. So let's go walk through Tanstack Start's implementation of using server functions just as a demo. So the idea is that you've got a button on there. You click on the button and it adds one to a count, but the count is persisted on the server. So the first thing we need to do is define where that's located. That's located in count.txt. We can see that that actually exists currently, and it's got 0 in there, so we're starting off with a 0 count. We then define a read count function that's going to read from that file and get that value back. Read count is not a server function, so let's go and add a server function that can then go and get that count using read count. So to create a server function, we just use create server function from Tanstack Start. First thing we give it is the method that we want to use. So in this case, we want this to be a get request because we're just getting the count. And then you give it an implementation. So the implementation at this point is just to call read count. Now let's create one for updating the count. So again, we use create server function, but in this case, we're going to use a post because this is mutation. We're going to change something on the server. And the way that we do that is we then go and read the count, and then we just add a value to the count. All right, so the first thing we need to know when we invoke this route is what's the current count, because we're going to want to send that onto the button to say add one to say what the current count is. So to do that, we're going to define a loader inside the route. This loader is going to get invoked anytime you do a navigation or a refresh of this route. In this case, it's going to make that call to get count and get the count from the disk. To use that state, we then take that route that we got back and we use a hook that it created called use loader data to get back the state. The great thing about this is that this is going to be inherently type safe. We can take a look at state. It's going to be a number. Why is that a number? Well, read count returns a number. It returns the parse int. That's going to give you a number. And then loader, which is defined as an input to create file route, which gives us back route. We know the typing on that loader so that when you use route.useLoaderData, you get that typing, which is awesome. All right, now let's go put a button on it. So we use a ShadCN button to give us add one to state. And then when we click it, we do update count. Let's give it a try. All right, add one to 0. And I'm clicking, but nothing's happening. So let's go take a look and see what's happening over in our cursor. If you take a look at count.txt, ooh, count is updated. So I'm guessing if I go back here and I hit refresh, yeah, we'll get the new value. So what's actually happening here? Well, what's happening is that the router doesn't know that there's been any changes. So it doesn't know to rerun that loader to get the new data to use loader data to go and put it into the button. So let's go and tell the router that our path is now invalid. To do that, we use the use router hook to bring in the router. And then when we've successfully updated the count, then we invalidate that route, and that's going to call that loader, which is then going to give us the data, which we then put into that button. Let's go take a look. And yeah, there you go. Awesome. So if you don't know much about server functions, let's talk a little bit about how they're actually working. So what actually happens is when I click this button, we get a network request. So let's click on that. And now we get 2 network requests. Actually, the first one is the post to our function 1, which happens to be the update. So we can see that the payload there is that we have a request of 1. That's how much we want to increment it by. And then there is a response, and the response in this case is nothing. we didn't send back any data with our server function. So the next thing that's going to happen is that the router is going to, again, do that load. So that's going to call that second server function, the get version. So let's go take a look at the headers on that one. We can see that the request method there, because over in the code, we defined that our server function for get count uses the get method. We then do a get. There's no payload because there's no actual parameters to get count. And then we get back the response. And in this case, that's 10. So conceptually, what's actually happening here is that create server function is just creating API routes for you. And that's really important to understand. There's nothing unique going on here. When we make a server function call from the client, all that's happening is that you're running fetch code that was created by that create server function call on the client. That's doing a standard fetch, either a get or a post or whatever method you want to put on it, back to the server to a specific route. In this case, _server, and then that particular function. It's wrapping up all the arguments as the payload, and then it's handling getting that data back. And then on the server, if you look over in the console, you can see that every time we click on something, then we get the request to that function, and they're logged in development mode so you can actually see what's happening. So let's go and contrast and compare this code with the exact same implementation on the most recent version of NextJS, that's NextJS 15, with the new caching support use cache. So here's that exact same page, but now it's implemented in NextJS 15. Of course, all of that code, again, is available to you in a link in the description right down below. So you can go and run it for yourself and see which one do you like. So there's a few differences between what you might have seen from NextJS pre-15 and pre this use cache directive. So right at the start in that read count, we're telling the Next.js using use cache that it needs to cache this count, and then we give it a tag that we will invalidate later when we change that count. So this is how you define caching in Next.js 15. If over here in the config, you have this dynamic IO set to true, and you're on the canary release of 15. Now let's talk about the server functions. There's two of them, again, get count and update count. You don't have to use create server functions. You just define the functions, and then you use the use server pragma to tell it that this is a server function. The other unique thing that we're doing here is revalidating that count tag. Again, we defined that count tag up here in read count. We said that the data for that count is associated with this tag count. And so we are then invalidating that tag if we ever change count, which we're doing using write file. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this is actually going to run the client. So we've got our big add 1 to 0 there. Let's click on that, and we can see that we're updating that count. That's cool. So how's it actually doing it? Well, again, it's calling off to the server. Let's go take a look at that. So I click on this. We can see that we get a request to localhost. So it's going to the same exact endpoint. So in this case, / it's using a request method of post. And then down here, you can actually see, and you can see that we're specifying a next action in the headers. That's telling Next that when you process this request, that you want to invoke this particular action. Server functions used to be called server actions, so that's why it's next action. The payload is what our arguments we're sending to it. In this case, that's 1, because we're incrementing it by 1. And then the response is a bunch of flight code. That's serialized RSCs. And that's why it's a little bit different in its implementation than how it's done on Tanstack Start. What's actually happening is that because we do the revalidate tag inside of the server action, Next.js is saying, oh, okay, cool. Well, page depends on that tagged cached data. So I'm just going to revalidate that whole route, turn that into RSC, and then send it back to the client that's then going to update the page. That's why we're not making a subsequent GET request to get count. In fact, get count isn't actually run at all in this scenario. So let's actually fix that. Let's see how a GET request is run off the client. I've got a component here called just get it. It's got a button that we can click to go and get that count. So let's go and use that. So we'll bring in just get it. We'll put it in there underneath the counter client, and then we'll give it the get count server function that we created. Now we go over here to get count. We can see that we make another request to localhost, and we can see that that get to get count is actually a post, and that's a big deal. So we're getting data from the server. It's not actually doing any mutations, but we're using an HTTP method post that implies that we are making mutations to the server. Now, if you're using something like a content delivery network or a CDN, having this be a post is kind of a problem because CDNs generally don't cache posts. Now, I do have a section on caching server actions on my Next.js course, pro-nextjs.dev. Not going to get into that now. Next up, we'll take a look at a feature that Next.js supports, but that Tanstack Start doesn't currently. And then I'll show you a feature of Start that just blows the doors off of Next.js, so be sure to stick around for all that. But before I cover that, let's talk about this week's sponsor, and that's Infinite Red. Now, when you work with cutting-edge stuff like this Tanstack Start, sometimes you get stuck. And when I get stuck, I've got a bunch of folks that I can reach out to. And for React Native, I reach out to my good friends, the sponsor of this week's video, Infinite Red. Infinite Red is the OG React Native consultancy. They have been a core element of the React community from the start. They are the trusted experts on React Native that not only do I trust, but many big companies trust as well. Check out these testimonials. Mercari, Zoom, and more. And the list of companies that they've helped includes some of the biggest in the industry like Microsoft, ZoomCare, Blue Jeans, and more. Infinite Red also contributes to the community as well. Every year they host the Chain React conference right here in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. I super appreciate that. And I was really honored to talk there last year. They have fantastic open source projects as well, like the Ignite framework that accelerates your application development with all of the foundational elements that every application needs. So if you need help with your React Native development, then I can think of no better company to work with than my friends at Infinite Red. As promised, let's take a look at one thing that Next.js can do with server actions that Tanstack Start currently can't, and that is return components from server functions. So let's create a server function that returns a component. But the really cool part here is that the server function can return JSX, in this case, a div with the time in it. That can also include client components, which is great. So let's actually see this work. So I just happen to have a date display component lying around that takes get date as an input. So let's go bring that in. And then we'll invoke it down here just below date display. Let's hit save. And now we can see that we have the current time. And if I refresh, we get the new time. And it is coming in that big red text. So it is coming in that div. Now, if I wanted that to be cached, all I need to do is go and add use cache, hit save. And now I'll get the same time every time, I think for the default, which is, I think 15 minutes. And then it'll get flushed and I'll get a new value after 15 minutes. So a really cool way to add caching and also control caching using things like that cache tag that I showed you before. Of course, to remove the caching, I simply just remove that use cache directive. And now it's no longer cached. So easy. Now, Tanstack Start doesn't currently support returning RSCs from server functions, but I have strong assurances from Tanner Lindsley that once React 19 rolls around and is finalized and Tanstack Start is in production ready mode, it's not currently, it's in alpha mode, that we will get that functionality. So expect that everything that Next.js can do in terms of server functions that Tanstack Start will be able to do as well. And I gotta say, right now, Tanstack Start can do something that absolutely blows the doors off of Next.js. Let's go take a look at that. So over my Tanstack Start project, I've got a chat route. Now let's go take a look at what that actually looks like. So I go to the chat route on Tanstack Start. You see that I get a little say something down here, say hello to me. And there you go. It goes off to OpenAI and ChatGPT and gets us back a result. Really cool, right? So how does this actually work? Well, this code uses the AI library from Vercel, both to talk to the AI, but also to give us this use chat hook that we then use in our UI. Let's go take a look at the UI first. So we've got our chat component that uses first this use chat hook from Vercel's AI toolkit. And that gives us back a list of messages. Those are the messages that are our conversation. And then it's got some handlers for our input fields. So one would be the input, which is the current value of the input. Then handle input change, which is for when I actually type into that field. And then handle submit, which we use a form tag to then handle a submit to an API endpoint. Now, we're actually going to trick the use chat hook into calling our server function. Now, normally use chat is going to use fetch to then fetch to an endpoint that you want. You can define whatever that endpoint is. By default, it's API chat. Now we're going to override that fetch entirely and give it our own custom fetch, which is then just going to call our server function. You can see how complicated that is here. We just define a new fetch. We give it the profile of a window fetch call to handle TypeScript. And then we just call chat and we take whatever the body was. That's going to be the list of messages. And then we just send that on to the chat server function The server function is a post. It takes a list of messages. We then send that to GPT-4 Turbo, and then we get back the stream from GPT-4 Turbo. That's the big difference here, is that we can return a stream from our server functions. That's why if I go back here and I say, give me a recipe for brownies, this comes back as a stream. You don't have that same streaming functionality with Next.js 15 server actions. You can kind of DIY a stream, but this is a standard HTTP response stream. So at the end of the day, I'm really excited about these Tanstack Start server functions. If you are too, please let me know in the comments right down below. Go check out the code on your own. See if you are interested in them or you like them or about Tanstack Start in general. Of course, thank you to my friends over at Infinite Red for sponsoring this video. In the meantime, of course, if you like this video, please hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell and be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.